Good afternoon, everybody. This is William with the Fincastle Underground. Today is November 28th, 2018. It is 4:20 in the afternoon, and I am very privileged to have back with us again Mr. Brendan Marotta of American Circumcision fame. His new film, American Circumcision, is out, and it's available. And if I'm not mistaken, you just won some new awards for that, Brendan.
That's right. We were at the Outer Docks Film Festival and got Best Feature-Length Documentary there.
That's fantastic. And you had another one prior to that some of these people might not be aware of?
Yeah, well, before that, we'd won an award at the Social Justice Film Festival, and then we'd won another at the Lone Star Film Festival. So the film is out now, and it's playing at a few select groups across the country, and then also available on Vimeo and Amazon and iTunes and all the places you get movies.
That's awesome. It's interesting. In my live stream earlier, I had a gentleman in Australia that showed great interest in it. So he's going to be in touch with you, possibly for a screening down there.
That's great. If you're international, Vimeo is the best place to get it because I know it's available worldwide there.
Okay. All right. I will definitely pass that along. And it's a fantastic film. I was lucky enough to get an advanced screening of it, and it just blew me away. Things that I thought I knew about this topic, and I'm well versed in the topic. This took it to a whole other level, and I think it'll do that for anyone who sees it. But you're here, we're kind of on a sour note, actually, but interestingly, something that we predicted in our last interview together. I have here an article that you sent me from U.S. News and World Report. Genital mutilation charges dismissed in Detroit area case. A federal judge in Detroit says regulating female genital mutilation is up to states and that Congress has no authority to enact the 1996 law banning it. Out of Detroit, a federal judge dismissed some charges Tuesday against 8 people, including 2 doctors, in the genital mutilation of 9 girls at a suburban Detroit clinic, finding it's up to states rather than Congress to regulate the practice. U.S. District Judge Bernard Friedman dismissed mutilation and conspiracy charges against Dr. Jumana Nagarwala, who performed the surgery, and Dr. Fakhruddin Attar, who allowed his clinic in Livonia, Michigan, to be used for the procedure. The same charges were dismissed against Attar's wife, Farida, and Tahira Safiq, who assisted in the procedure, as well as 4 women who took their daughters to the clinic. 4 of the girls are from Michigan. The others are residents of Illinois and Minnesota. Congress overstepped its bounds by legislating to prohibit female genital mutilation, Friedman wrote in a 28-page opinion. Michigan was the 26th U.S. state to officially ban the practice, also known as female circumcision or cutting. The state law was passed a few months after Nagarwala's April 2017 arrest. Female genital mutilation has been condemned by the United Nations, but is common for girls in some parts of Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. Nagarwala said she performed a religious custom on girls from her Muslim sect, the India-based Dawoodi Bohra. She still faces conspiracy to travel with intent to engage in illicit sexual conduct and obstruction charges. Others in the case face obstruction charges. I did think he would rule in our favor, defense attorney Shannon Smith said of Friedman. Smith filed a motion on behalf of Nagarwala to have the charges dismissed. When I first started researching, I was not sure how strong the motion would be, but I became more confident this would be the right result, she said. A spokeswoman said Tuesday that the U.S. Attorney's Office was reviewing Friedman's opinion. Smith said that if the ruling is appealed, that, quote, we're hoping the Court of Appeals and Supreme Court agree that the 1996 law was unconstitutional. They're hoping for that. And that's it. I don't even know where to go for that. But that's why I have you here.
Yeah, well, the short version is that a federal court has ruled that the 1996 law against female genital mutilation, female circumcision, is unconstitutional. And they made this ruling on the basis of 2 things. First, a little background. The doctor involved was arrested for doing what's known as type 4, I believe it's type 4 circumcision. It is the lightest form possible. So one of the things that people don't know about female genital cutting is that there's different types. And I think when people in the United States imagine female circumcision, they imagine the most radical kind. They imagine some poor African girl being held down in a bush, cut with a rusty razor blade, having all of her external genitals removed. And what was practiced in this case was considered a much lighter form. So there was what was known as a ritual nick, which is where they draw a drop of blood from that part of the body and leave the external genitals there. So nothing's removed, but you are touching that part of a child's body and drawing blood from it, which Western culture considers abhorrent. Yet at the same time, the group involved in the case and their attorneys argue that this is far less invasive than male circumcision, which is accepted in the United States, and that it is their religious and cultural right to practice this. So if Jewish people have the right to practice their form of genital cutting, they argue they should have the right to practice their form of genital cutting. And that may sound like a shocking position to some Americans, because in American culture, the mainstream culture tells us that male circumcision is perfectly fine. It doesn't remove anything of value. And at the same time, that female circumcision is horrible and a gross violation of women's rights. But the idea that there are forms of female circumcision that are less invasive than male circumcision is actually commonly accepted among people who follow the issue. So the famed attorney for the defense, Alan Dershowitz, who was wasn't their attorney, but he was consulting with the defense. Mm-hmm. He argued online, he argued in a New York Times letter to the editor and on his Twitter account that this was far less invasive than male circumcision, and that's his religious right. He's a Jewish man, and that should be okay. And that it wasn't, he actually even argued that it wasn't female circumcision because he seemed to be unaware that there are different types of female circumcision, and this is what's classified by the World Health Organization as a form of female circumcision. The ritual nick is still female circumcision.
Right.
And
I'd like to point out, actually, in the we have all these technical terms for types of circumcision. I just want to bring it back to the subjective experience of the boy or the girl who's having the adults they trust in their life
right
down and violate their genitals in any way.
Yeah, it's one of the things that activists against all types of circumcision say is that the human rights violation isn't the amount that you cut off, it's touching someone else's body and removing parts of it without their consent. So if you were to cut off, the tip of my finger, is that somehow not a human rights violation, but you cut off the whole hand and it is? Or like, where do you draw the line? It's the first cut, when you cut into someone else's body, that activists consider the human rights violation. It is the moment that child's right to their own body is broken, and their trust to the adults in their life is broken, and their sense of security is broken. We treat other forms of touching of people without their consent the same way. It's not like, there's any similar equivalent where you're allowed to somewhat touch someone's body without their consent. It's all considered not okay.
Right. And in America, as you know, from years of study, that the genitals exist in this weird nebulous zone where they're not part of the body. They're like an accoutrement to the body. The body exists in one legal framework, and then the genitals have this whole other special place in our society, right, wrong, or indifferent.
Right. People have a lot of psychological splits around their sexuality and somehow see it as something separate from themselves. And that is especially true when it comes to children. I mean, people especially do not want to think about that. And I think that comes from a genuine place of not wanting to mistreat children. Mm-hmm. But in the case of this particular court case, what the judge actually ruled was that the federal law preventing people from doing this to little girls was unconstitutional. And this was ruled partially on a technicality and partially on something that has much wider implications. So the judge said that Congress does not have the right to regulate this, that usually crimes of assault are left up to the states. So if you rape someone or you murder someone, that is, the state will try you, but it's not the federal government. There's only certain crimes that the federal government can prosecute. And so it said, well, the defense made the argument, this does not relate to interstate commerce. And I think a lot of people would be sympathetic to that argument, the idea that the federal government should be as small and non-invasive as possible. But at the same time, people have sort of a natural revulsion to female genital cutting and go, well, I don't know, maybe that should be illegal.
Right. Well, it's worth noting here that some of these girls were from out of state, in fact. And also one of the ones I read, they told the girl she was going to a theme park or something. if you have to tell that to a kid to get him to go along with it, what kind of person are you?
Right. Yeah. The prosecution said, well, what you mentioned, that there was a medical procedure performed and that involved traveling between states, and said, well, that is interstate commerce. And the defense said, well, it's, or the judge essentially said, well, it's not a medical procedure technically, so it doesn't count as commerce, which is another weird sort of double standard between this and male circumcision, which brings me to the second reason the judge said that the federal law was unconstitutional. The judge said that this was not non-discriminatory, that it did not protect people regardless of the basis of race or gender or sex or background, and that as a consequence, since it didn't protect children on a non-discriminatory basis, he wasn't sure that the law would be upheld, meaning that it only protected girls and it did not protect boys or intersex children or other people who might be subjected to genital cutting.
Exactly. I know that anti-circumcision activists, now known as intactivists, have argued for years that this law that we're referencing, it's the 1996 anti-female genital cutting law introduced by Pat Schroeder of Colorado, and I believe it went into effect in 97. Intactivists have argued for years that the law in and of itself violates the 14th Amendment because it doesn't protect both boys and girls based on the verbiage of the law itself to include the term circumcision.
Right. And a similar law was introduced in San Francisco. In 2012, activists there tried to introduce the SF-MGM bill, which was exactly the same language as the federal law against female genital mutilation, but with the gender reverse, so it protected boys from male circumcision. And a court there struck it down, again, on a technicality. But huge organizations
it did pass, though, did it not?
It never made it to vote, unfortunately. So there were large organizations that were funding a lot of money to lawyers to stop it from going to the ballot. Organizations like the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, and even the ACLU actually contributed a lot of money to this. The ACLU, interestingly, also a spokesperson for their organization opposed a criminalization of female genital cutting in Maine. And so it seems like there is some fear there by members of the organization, or at least some members of the organization, of there being any law against genital cutting for some reason. And in the case of the arguments made against the SF-MGM bill, people made arguments that are very similar actually to why this law was removed. They said, well, it's my religious right to cut boys' genitals, and this infringes on my religious right, and so you shouldn't be allowed to do that. Now, the judge removed it on a technicality. Again, it was this law that said local cities in San Francisco could not regulate medicine. But again, circumcision exists in this weird sort of gray zone where you don't actually have to be a medical practitioner to do it. You could be simply a religious person and do it, and many of the people who do it in traditional religious ceremonies have no medical training at all.
Right. No, I understand that. I talked on my show a while ago about Jewish circumcision, where there was a rabbi going around in the ultra-Orthodox, who you and I have discussed, that when they perform the circumcision, the rabbi actually sucks the blood out of the baby's penis with his very own mouth. And there was a rabbi going around giving babies herpes in this manner, and they weren't able to even stop him because of his religious freedom. And what boggled my mind is that parents would still call upon this man and say, aren't you the rabbi that's in the newspapers for giving babies herpes? Yeah, all right, well, come on over and do it to my kid. And without on that train of thought, I was just talking, when this doctor was performing this genital nicking of female, the doctor in the story in Detroit that this is all surrounding, this goes back to the weird intersectionality of medicine and custom. She knew she was breaking what was already a federal law. So she knew she was doing something illegal at the time.
Right. It's really hard to prosecute these cases because the only people who know it's happening are the doctor, who's not going to talk about it, the parents, who aren't going to talk about it, and, 5-6-year-old girls. And who don't, even if they come forward, they might not be believed, and they might not even know that they can talk about it. Everyone in their family and their culture tells them this is normal and they should be okay with it.
That sounds a lot like our culture when it comes to male circumcision, where it's normal and we can't talk about it.
Right. And there is there's different cultural standards around it, because the wider culture in America sees female circumcision and female genital cutting as really abhorrent and wrong. And this case was actually the first test of federal laws against female genital cutting. It was the first prosecution ever under those laws. And activists have said that this is kind of the worst case they could have chosen to test these laws. Like, it was, in some way, I don't know what federal prosecutors were thinking when they were picking this as a case. I think that they didn't understand the nuance of this issue, because they picked a case where there was a strong religious claim that this was their custom and their right to do. They picked the lightest, least invasive form of female genital cutting, and they picked a case where it was done in a medical office, and they could say, well, this is a medical practice, and we were doing this very safely, with all the things you'd expect from a medical practice. Right. So in some way, it was the worst case for them to pick to test this law.
Do you think that might have been by design in order to legalize this for certain interest groups in our country?
I don't have any evidence that that would be the case. I would not ascribe to malice what you could simply ascribe to incompetence or ignorance. I think that my guess, and I don't know anyone involved, so this is merely a guess, but my guess is just that they thought female genital cutting is wrong, and we caught some people who did it, and we should stop them. Now, what is interesting about the case is that, again, the judge ruled that this was unconstitutional on a technicality. It's just the federal government doesn't have the right to do this. So state laws against female genital cutting still exist. And 27 states have laws against them, and 23 do not. So right now, you might argue that there are 23 states where it's legal and 27 where it isn't. However, he did imply in his statement that laws against genital cutting that are not non-discriminatory, where one gender is protected and one isn't, are unconstitutional as well and might be ruled against if the state laws are tried. And I think what's going to happen is that this case is going to go to higher courts, and those laws are going to be tested. And what we're going to see in very slow motion is the realization that you cannot outlaw genital cutting for one gender and not outlaw it for the other. That eventually we will either have laws against both male and female circumcision, or female circumcision will become legal. And I suspect that there are groups in this country that would rather see female circumcision legalized than risk giving up what they see as their religious or cultural right to cut boys' genitals.
Oh, absolutely. I think many people that watch my show regularly would understand that line of thinking. The American legal system could never be accused of being ahead of the curve. And this is just another example of that. Well, if there is a silver lining in this, and I've been talking to members of my YouTube fan base about this, is that we can re-examine this issue comprehensively. This is a long shot. I don't know if you're aware, but there is a movement going on in this country, an underground movement, where it's basically open season on child predators. People have had it up to here with what they view as child predation, and I'm sure many people would see harming the genitals of a child as another egregious violation. So the tide may turn against this sort of genital cutting against children. That's what I've been getting at in a roundabout way, is that we need to protect all children from invasive genital cutting. I never thought it would be such a radical idea.
Well, there is a movement working towards that. There's what's known as the genital autonomy movement, the movement that believes that all human beings have the right to their own bodies and that you have personal autonomy over your own body. You get to make what decisions about what happens to that body. People cannot cut off parts of that body without your consent. It is part of what's known as the intactivist movement, but it also involves groups that oppose intersex genital cutting and female genital cutting as well.
I'd like to say on that note, for anybody that's watching my show that has more of a patriotic bend, as we all do, what Brendan is talking about here is keeping in line with the founding principles of our country, bodily integrity. You have nothing coming into this world other than your body. You should at least be able to make decisions based on that, especially in the United States of America. We have no room in this country for this sort of outdated medieval mentality.
I think also a lot of people see circumcision as the religious rite of certain groups. And the argument that activists are making is that the same way a Christian does not have the right to tattoo a cross on their child, you don't have the right to do more invasive procedures in the name of your religion. And that child has the right to make their own decisions about what they believe and what their faith is. And if those decisions are made for them in the form of a physical brand or genital cutting or scar tissue or the removal of some part of their body, that their rights have been violated to their religion and their religious belief. And that I would also say to people who have the perspective that, well, we need to somehow get the child when they're young and put this upon their body. I know a lot of people in the intactivist movement and the movement against circumcision for whom this experience of circumcision and the anger and wounding that came with it was the reason they gave up religion. That this was actually so unacceptable to them that they thought, I couldn't possibly believe in a God who wanted this to happen to me, so I don't believe in any God at all. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of people who defend the practice on religious grounds are really afraid of losing that religious and cultural ground, not realizing that by defending it, they're going to open the door to other forms of genital cutting, like female circumcision, mm-hmm. for other religious practices to do, or any number of things that could happen to children.
Right. Well, things are bubbling up in this country. And I know you see that it might be a long march forward. I'm afraid you might be right. But also, I have a hope that America might finally be ready to take a good, long, hard look at itself and what it is that we stand for here. And I think a lot of people, especially my viewers, they know that it's basically all or nothing right now. Either we're Americans with liberty, and that's what we stand for, or we're going to accept some level of control that ultimately comes to total control of us all. So
I think there are people involved on this issue who really would like to see human rights for all children. And I think there are also people who are involved on the other side of this issue who would be willing to give up the rights of girls to protect their ability to cut off parts of boys' genitals.
Right. Well, I know you're very factual in these matters, and you're not prone to speculate. I am. I tend to wonder about a lot of things. But big money and big commercialized interests have been involved in circumcision in America since its inception. A lot of people don't realize it's only been here since the 1880s at the earliest. And there were people like Henry Ford, John Harvey Kellogg, the graham cracker guy, that helped push this and make it popular. And even today, as we talked about in our last interview, Hillary Clinton with the Clinton Foundation for PEPFAR put $40 million into mass circumcision of boys. Can you talk a little bit more about some of the interests that might, the financial and corporate interests that might be at play in keeping this going for both boys and girls?
So I think there's a couple, and the two biggest and most obvious are the medical industry and what you might call religious and cultural activist groups. So the medical industry is the most obvious. They make money on circumcision, and there is a massive legal liability in admitting fault on circumcision. So if they say this procedure that we did on the majority of men in America was wrong and harmful, every one of those men would have a potential lawsuit. And that is a...
This has happened, in fact. Some men have sued the doctors and hospitals and won.
Yes.
It's not very common, but it's a legal possibility.
It absolutely is. It is difficult because the laws vary state to state, and medical lobbies, which have a lot of influence, have as much as possible reduced the statute of limitations on those. So some of them, like, you have to sue 3 years after it happens, and if you're 3 years old, you're probably not going to be able to get a lawyer on your own, right? Mm-hmm. Others you can sue when you're 18 for things that happen to you as a child. There's a window there, but it's maybe 1 to 2 years or 3 years after you turn 18. And they're difficult because the challenge there is that law follows culture. Mm-hmm. So something that might be right might not be what a judge or jury rules. And so because the majority of American culture doesn't see the foreskin as having value, doesn't really understand this issue, you'd have to make that case to those people. And it is possible. And not a lot of people have done it. I mean, similar to this case, up until this case that we're talking about now, no one had tested the federal laws against female genital cutting. This was the first case of it, and no one had gotten that far. And the moment someone got that far, the whole thing was overturned. So there is a possibility for people taking similar legal action against male circumcision. But I think if you're going to do that, you have to be prepared for the fight it'll take, because we're talking about the legal system, and we're talking about a lot of powerful interests you may be up against.
Right. You're lucky if it takes 2.5 years at minimum. You've been following this case closer than I have, but I've been watching it. Has anybody talked about how this woman this doctor has fundamentally violated the parameters of their medical license? Has anyone talked about suspending their license?
So it's interesting.
Nobody's touching that.
It's interesting you should mention that. A couple years ago, the American Academy of Pediatrics released a statement on female genital cutting, in which they said, because doctors are allowed to do male circumcision, which is much more invasive than some types of female genital cutting. I mean, they said this in their paper. This is a group that has members that do circumcisions and has defended the practice in the past. Because they're allowed to do male circumcision, that doctors should be able to do a ritual nick on little girls' genitals for parents who want that. So the American Academy of Pediatrics actually at one point made the argument that doctors like this doctor should be able to do what they did. And there was a huge outcry from all sorts of different groups, including groups against female genital cutting and groups against male genital cutting, and they quickly retracted that policy statement. But what's interesting is that that same argument has now been proposed by the defense in this case in Detroit. And so I don't know that American medical groups have a lot of standing to even combat something like this, because their position on male circumcision has been this is a cultural custom and we should be allowed to do cultural customs that the parents want. And so they've given away the intellectual and moral and philosophical ground to even combat something like this.
This is a far cry from their 1976 statement where they roundly condemned male circumcision. That changed after that.
Yeah, I have heard from people involved on the issue that basically there were people involved who realized the legal liability of a statement like that and quickly backtracked. And there's also people within the organization who really genuinely love and support circumcision and did not like the thing that they do being condemned by the organization they're a part of.
Right. Well, let's talk about that. There's a few things. There are groups, as you said, that are pushing for legalizing male and female circumcision, and I'm not afraid to name them. You've already named some: the Anti-Defamation League, the American Civil Liberties Union, the AAP. So
those organizations, I want to correct that really quick. They would argue that they're very much against female circumcision, but they would also argue that the two practices are really different, that male circumcision is a medical and religious custom, and female circumcision is always a horrible violation of women's rights.
Right.
I think, though, when push comes to shove, they would rather, and this is my opinion, they would rather cave on female circumcision than risk losing male circumcision.
Right. So,
and their actions indicate that that's their perspective.
Right. Well, from where I'm sitting, basically, I could see them arguing that, but basically, they're not being intellectually honest, and they're talking. They don't have a spine, essentially, in my opinion.
They have one for the practices they want to protect.
And it's not just the practices. There is money behind it. But without going too far afield, I know you recently spent some time with the AAP. Do you have time to talk about that, or did you want to mention what your experiences were?
So I think that I'll talk about it briefly. I think the perspective of a lot of activists for a long time has been that the American Academy of Pediatrics is this big organization that doesn't listen to activists, and that they just have lots of money and they're completely oblivious to these cultural conversations that are happening. And what I found after visiting their convention area at the most recent convention was that they're actually listening really well. They're just also really afraid. And I guess I should say they're listening but not hearing. That makes sense. They know that there's this thing coming towards them. They know that there's this wider cultural conversation happening around circumcision, And it really scares them because they've never faced a problem like this before. And I think they view groups like the Intactivist movement as a sort of consumer revolt. You know, they just take the attitude that there's all sorts of different people who are going to get mad at you for what you do. And you just have to ignore that. You know, there's trolls on the internet. There's people upset about things. And they don't realize what they're dealing with is a human rights movement, that this is not going away any more than, you know, if you were to spray water on the people who marched in civil rights movements in the 60s, that they would go away, right? They think that they can simply ignore this and it'll end. And I think that when people feel like their legitimate grievances are not being heard, they get louder, not quieter, because they really want to be heard. And right now they feel like they're not being heard, but they feel that way because the organization is incredibly silent on the issue. They're not talking about it publicly, but they are definitely talking about it within their organization. And they're definitely having meetings talking about not just the activists involved, but I know that they know who I am. I know that they have had conversations about me and trying to figure out how to handle me. Mm-hmm. And I suspect that if they respond, it won't be directly, it will be through other channels and means. It will be through the money and influence they have, not directly having a conversation. And I think that's unfortunate because I'd really like to have the direct conversation with them.
Right.
I'm sympathetic to the fact that they have legal concerns and liabilities that might mean that they can't ever fully condemn this issue. I'm sympathetic to the fact that a lot of doctors involved are just doing what they think is culturally correct and following the organization they're a part of. And I'm sympathetic to the fact that they just want to do their jobs and they don't really want to deal with these larger cultural concerns. Mm-hmm. And so I'm willing to, you know, I think a lot of other activists and people involved on the issue and scholars and academics and people in the media, there's a lot of people who feel that way, that they would be willing to have a dialogue on this issue and meet those concerns. But the organizations involved aren't talking about them publicly, mm-hmm. and they're not having that conversation. And again, I think it's just fear. It's that, you know, having that conversation might open the possibility that someone would turn against them and that there would be legal avenues to pursue against them.
Oh, I'm certain they're afraid of the legal. Doctors, most of their expenses is malpractice insurance.
Right.
So they're always concerned and thinking about legalistic maneuvers and protecting themselves. My prediction, if they don't outright criminalize male circumcision, it'll probably end as these doctors just get away from it and retire, and the new ones just don't even touch it because of legalistic fear. You know, so that's the slow road to ending it.
Yeah, I don't think they've realized that the long-term harm of an issue like this could be much more damaging to their reputation than handling it now, because it's not going away. The issue is not going away. And especially if male circumcision is used as a justification to legalize female circumcision and female genital cutting in the United States, then I think people will draw the line between that and the arguments made by American medical groups. And they will realize that these groups, by not addressing the issue of male circumcision, by not engaging activists involved on the issue of male circumcision, are in some way culpable for allowing female genital cutting to become legal in the United States.
Right. Well, things are, and as you mentioned before, that the activists are just going to get louder. We have the internet now. This very quaint academic discussion that you and I have been having for some time now, this never would have seen the light of day even a decade ago. We could have filmed it on a VHS recorder, and how would we distribute it? Now, when I upload it, at least 1,000 people will see it at a bare minimum, and who knows beyond that. So our voices are getting louder. I know you approached this with some neutrality when you started the documentary film, but it just becomes so obvious that something's not quite right here. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I think that people think that because I can understand the intactivist perspective, that must mean I'm one of them, because no one involved on the issue previously has been able to understand and sympathize with the intactivist perspective and not immediately jump to it as a positionality. Mm-hmm. And I feel like I can understand the perspective of both sides. And I would like to be in a position where I can help increase the dialogue between them. But part of the challenge is that there are people involved who don't want there to be a dialogue at all.
Mhm.
And so they see me wanting to have the dialogue as an attack in some way, when it really is just an invitation to dialogue.
Right. Well, again, my perspective would be that anybody that would be in that situation, why would they talk to? You're essentially a reporter, a documentary filmmaker. Just talking about it could open somebody up to legal liability if they have that mindset. They don't want to even admit something might be askew.
Yeah, and I'm willing to have off-the-record conversations with people. I've definitely had that with people on multiple sides of the debate. So, it's one of those things where I'm open to that, but like we've said, there's a lot of fear around it.
Well, we can put out a plea right here. I know you to be a genuine, very methodical man who's not prone to rash decisions. If there's somebody watching this show that's involved in the medical community or has a position on the inside of the AAP, contact Mr. Marotta, and you can tell them how to contact them in a moment, and he will protect your anonymity. We really just want to get to an understanding here. A dialogue would be a huge step forward compared to what's come before. So how could people contact you?
So you can find me at brennanmarotta.com. There's a contact page there with my email. And you can find me on all social media at bdmarotta.com on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter.
Right. And I'll put the links to your website down in the description of this video. One final thing I wanted to touch on, because we've kind of circled around it. We've talked all the time about the foreskin having no perceived value. To me, this is the crux of it. I've heard on my show the past couple of times that this topic has come up, people always, without fail say, I'm circumcised and I'm fine. I've got no problem with pleasure. And I've tried to explain in the simplest terms possible. They've done it to you when you're a day old. You have no comparison whatsoever. And it's like a colorblind person. Of course, they can still see, but they're not getting the full spectrum of experience. So if you could talk a moment about why the foreskin does have value, I think if that clicks with people, they'll understand the whole issue. It's not just the piece of skin.
Well, I'll start with the fact that circumcised women say the same thing. They say, I'm fine with it. I'm healthier for it. It's cleaner. I interview a circumcised woman who is in favor of maintaining the practice in the film, who says these things. Mm-hmm. And they even say, some of them even say, my sex life is better after I was circumcised. So, what do you say to that? I think most Americans, when they hear it, they go, well, maybe she's okay with the fact she was circumcised, but women should be allowed to choose for their own bodies, which is the argument that activists against male circumcision are making. So I don't really feel like you need to even debate someone's perspective on their own body, because that's not really relevant for what we do to children, right? You may be perfectly fine with it. You might be fine removing all of your genitals. You might be fine getting any number of surgeries. You might be fine getting all the surgeries necessary to transition from one gender to another. And as an adult, that is your right to do. You have the absolute freedom to do that. But I think where people get upset is when you start doing those things to children, because while you may be okay with the experience, a child might not be. And when it comes to the question of the value of the foreskin, because I think that a lot of people, when they have that discussion, they don't want to explore the feeling of loss they might have if that part did have value and they didn't have it anymore. But the unfortunate truth is that the foreskin has the most nerve endings of any point on a man's body, just like the clitoris has the most nerve endings of any point on a woman's body. And if you were to remove the clitoris from a woman, she could still have G-spot orgasms, right? She can still feel all the sensation on the inside of her vagina and all of the pleasure that comes with that. And women who are circumcised report still being able to have G-spot orgasms. Some can even still have clitoral orgasms because there's a large portion of the clitoris that's inside the body. Yet, at the same time, there is a sensation that comes from the head of the clitoris that that woman would not be able to feel anymore. Similarly, men who are intact have reported that there are different sensations that come from the ridged band of the foreskin and the frenulum, that connecting piece of tissue on the underside of the penis, that are different than those that come from the head of the penis. And that men actually are able to have different sensations from their genitals. So when you talk to men and they say, I'm fine, I think most of them think they're fine because they can orgasm. but they can only have one type of orgasm. And the sensations they're getting, when I talk to men about their sexuality, it's very generalized, right? Well, it feels good on my penis when it goes in the woman, right? But they're not aware that there might be different sensations that would come from the inner lining of the foreskin or the frenulum or the ridge band that they might not be experiencing otherwise. They just know the one type of orgasm that they know, and they don't know these other sensations. And if you look at the research, the head of the penis actually doesn't have a lot of sensation in it. And you can, not too graphic, but you can run a sensation test on yourself. You can run your finger along different parts of your body and feel what sensations are there. And I think most men will find that the area above the scar line that they have, if they're circumcised, the area above the scar line is more sensitive than the area below it. And that area above the scar line is the remnant foreskin. It is the remaining inner lining tissue of the foreskin. And if they were intact, they would have about 15 to 12 square inches more of that tissue. So take that amount of your remaining skin and add that many square inches. And then the ridge band of the foreskin has even more nerve endings than that.
Mm-hmm. Well, see, that's the interesting thing. The guys that, when they say I'm circumcised and I'm fine, I ask them to name the intricate portions of the foreskin, and they're like, what do you mean? It's the foreskin. Like, no, there's parts of the foreskin.
Right.
It's a compendium of different structures.
It's similar to how women who undergo the most severe type of female circumcision don't know that there's, the labia, the clitoral hood, the clitoris. There's all these different parts on a woman.
Mm-hmm. And well, it's worth mentioning too, one thing that we didn't talk about, it fundamentally changes. The head of the penis is supposed to be internal. It's supposed to be a mucous membrane like the inside of your mouth or the inside of a woman's vagina. And when the foreskin is removed, it dries out and becomes calloused, literally calloused through a process called keratinization.
Right. And you could actually run a test on that to see what the difference would be. So if you were to cover the head of your penis, instead of being keratinized, normally if you're circumcised, your penis is rubbing against the inside of whatever you're wearing, of your underwear or your pants. And over time, it develops this callousness. The same way, like if you use your hands a lot, you get calluses on your hands, or like your elbows are probably rougher than the other portions of your arm. Mm-hmm. Over time, it gets this callousness because it's exposed to the elements and rubbing against things. And if you have your foreskin, that area is supposed to be covered. So you could run a sensation test where you cover the head of your penis completely for a week straight. You can do this just by wearing a condom for that long. It's like 1 to 3 weeks for dekeratinization to occur. And right. You could see how different the sensation is when that area is covered, when it's not rough anymore, when it becomes mucosal again. And there are men, there's actually one guy I know who that was what led him to activism. He just thought this whole anti-circumcision thing is ridiculous, and he's Jewish, and like, whatever, I'm in touch with my sexuality. I'll just try this and I'll prove it wrong. And then he tried it and it wasn't wrong. And he then went on to start an activist organization. So you can run these tests and see for yourself. I think a lot of people have this idea that they can only know their sexuality through what their culture tells them or some peer-reviewed study elsewhere. And you can know it through your own body. That is the way that most humans, are biologically designed to understand their sexuality.
Right. Well, it's a long road ahead, but I think we'll get there as a society and as a species. Well, is that, I have to say, Brendan, just talking with you is so refreshing. There are so few people in the world, and even fewer people in my personal life, where I can have these frank discussions about sexuality, and you're well educated, and we can hold an intellectual discussion about it. It's so rare that this happens. I just want to tell you, I appreciate you coming on here for that reason alone. You stimulate me no end when we talk about anything. I could talk about anything with you, and it would be stimulating. And you're a fantastic storyteller, and I mean that in the sense of your craft, with the way that this film unfolds. I think people are going to be really surprised and shocked when they see it, and I have to recommend it in every way that I possibly can. So is there anything else you'd like to talk about before we move on?
There's an infinite amount I could talk about this issue, but watching the film was the best introduction I could give someone. So I'd say see that.
It is a great primer for the topic, and it's going to go down in history as one of the great all-time documentary films. You're so ahead of your time on this. Anyway, well, thank you for being with us, and maybe we'll have you back sometime as your work and your life develops.
I'd appreciate it. Thank you.